Article 16 of the League of Nations Covenant mandated an automatic and collective embargo against any nation that started an aggressive war. This would be a terrible remedy, said US President Woodrow Wilson, but facing the cutoff of all financial, commercial, or personal intercourse, the argument went, nations would think twice before menacing their neighbors. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we are talking about sanctions, their history, economics, and what makes them successful or unsuccessful across the globe. Apologies for the sudden change in topic for this episode, but the current political environment necessitated that we talk about economic sanctions in this episode. In the early 1920s, the threat of economic sanctions deterred some smaller states from menacing their neighbors. But the League of Nations' highest profile sanctions were an utter failure. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, which was a member of the League of Nations and one of the few African nations to have escaped previous European colonization. Ethiopian leader Haile Selassie appealed to the League for assistance. The League voted 50-4 to impose sanctions on Italy. It banned loans and Italian imports, and it forbade exports of a range of materials including arms and metallic ores. But it left out a most crucial element: oil. Since Italy lacked petroleum resources of its own, a ban on oil might have crippled Italy's ability to wage war. But though Britain and France supported sanctions, they feared that a total embargo would drive Italy's fascist leader Benito Mussolini into an alliance with Nazi Germany. Subsequently, in 1936, Italian troops completed their conquest, and the League's failure to change the course of history reflected the difficulty of imposing sanctions. It was not the limitations of sanctions per se, but the political and economic complexity of imposing sanctions. During the Cold War, US Congress passed legislation enhancing the president's ability to use emergency provisions to impose sanctions on an array of Cold War rivals. The 1949 Export Control Act provided authority to control US trade with its enemies. Washington convinced Western Europe to cooperate in limiting exports of strategic goods to the Soviet bloc in the hope of constraining the Soviet arms buildup. North Korea and China, too, faced nearly complete trade embargoes. Applying sanctions, though, is usually a double-edged sword. The country applying sanctions hurts its own businesses that trade with or invest in the target country. US companies have had to stay away from Iran, German machine builders have had to reduce their exports to Russia, and French shipyards have suffered through the freezing and potential cancellation of the sale of Mistral ships to Russia. Sanctions can also provoke counter-sanctions. In 2014, Russia retaliated against Western measures by banning food imports from the countries that had joined sanctions against Moscow. The outcome of these geo-economic campaigns is not a zero-sum game. The stronger economy, backed by other forms of power, can incur more damage on the target country than it will sustain in return. But it does not always alter the political behavior of the government to be punished. Sometimes sanctions can make that behavior even more problematic. And ironically, the true winner may be a third party that jumps into the opening. European countries in the initial phases of the US-Iran sanctions are one such example. Also, China in the case of the current Western sanctions against Russia, and Russia in the case of post-Tiananmen Square Western weapons ban on China. So what factors determine the success of economic sanctions? There are many, but one factor that is extremely important to ensure success with respect to economic sanctions is cohesion. which means essentially a united front. That is, the economic sanctions must be implemented by the majority of the economic partners of the sanctioned state to maximize the chance of success. When there is a lack of international cohesion, the sanctioned state can find alternative suppliers to the one imposing the sanctions. Europe and the United States have put up a united joint front against Russia this time, but there is still the China variable, which could come in the way of this round of sanctions being successful. One of the biggest failures of cohesion when it comes to economic sanctions is the sanctions against North Korea. One of the recent reports from the Institute of Science and International Security mentioned that a whopping 49 countries have violated UN Security Council sanctions imposed on North Korea between 2014 and 2017. And these countries range from the poor and isolated nations like Angola to the wealthier global powers like Germany. Now, passing sanctions against Pyongyang at the UN is difficult because China and to some extent Russia tend to water down or veto the Security Council sanctions. And the sanctions have been broken under various categories by different countries. For example, some countries have participated in banned financial transactions and other business activities with North Korea. And this includes Brazil, China, Egypt, Germany, India, Iran, Russia, Singapore, etc. And there's another group that has imported goods and minerals from North Korea. And these set includes China, Egypt, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Iran, etc. And there's another group which includes Brazil, China, Egypt, Greece, and Japan that has helped North Korea with the business of shipping materials in and out of its country illicitly. And the fourth group is the one that has military ties with North Korea. So they participate in arms trading or military training. And these tend to be the poorer countries, including Angola, Cuba, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Mozambique, Tanzania, Myanmar, and Syria. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, China became North Korea's lifeline. It provides it with the vast majority of the food and energy and is also its leading trading partner. China has historically pushed back against the harshest economic punishments that the US has proposed on North Korea. China's main concern is not North Korea's nuclear program. Its main concern is almost the same as Vladimir Putin's with respect to Ukraine. The possibility that it would have US forces on its border in case of a North Korean collapse. In other words, North Korea is the buffer zone between China and the United States. Another factor that is important with respect to the success of economic sanctions is the type of regime. In case of North Korea, it's a dictatorship. So less accountability to the people. So the government can continue to operate without having to worry about getting toppled. But when it's a democracy and the sanctions are tough, the sanctions are more likely going to be successful. And that is what exactly happened in Finland in 1958 during the night frost crisis. During World War II, Finland's leaders realized that opposing the Soviet Union was not feasible. No international power was able to give the necessary support. Nazi Germany, which was Finland's chief supporter against Russia, was losing the war. Sweden was not big enough, and its leadership was wary of confronting Russia. The Western powers were allied with the Soviet Union during the war. So Finland had to face Soviet Russia, which was its neighbor, on its own, without anybody's protection. So Finland chose not to challenge Soviet Russia's foreign policy, but exerted caution to keep its independence. Finland signed an agreement of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with the Soviet Union in April of 1948, under which Finland was obliged to resist armed attacks by Germany or its allies against Finland or against the Soviet Union through Finland, and if necessary, ask for Soviet military aid to defend itself. At the same time, the agreement recognized Finland's desire to remain outside the great power conflicts, allowing the country to adopt a policy of neutrality during the Cold War. And as a result, Finland did not participate in the Marshall Plan, and it took neutral positions on Soviet overseas initiatives. And by maintaining cool relations to NATO and Western military powers, Finland was able to fend off Soviet pressure for affiliation to the Warsaw Pact. But in autumn of 1958, Finland realized that the Soviet-Finnish relationship was not as neutral as the Finns believed. In autumn of 1958, the Soviets were suddenly dissatisfied with Finnish domestic policy, and in particular with the composition of the third government to be formed under Prime Minister Carl August Fagerholm. And to make matters worse, on the 40th anniversary of the Communist Party of Finland, which was to be held in August, no visa was issued to the Soviet Union's delegation's preferred members. And the Soviet press created this as a case against the Fagerholm government. The Soviets immediately exerted economic sanctions on Finland, and the use of Saimaa Canal was suspended, and the Treaty on Fishing Rights in the Gulf of Finland was postponed, and all trade negotiations were held up. The crisis itself was given its name by Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who declared that relations between the Soviet Union and Finland had become subject to a night frost. Hence the term night frost crisis. The crisis attracted international attention, and in one of the meetings brokered by the Finnish industries, a United States Democratic Senator Herbert Humphrey met with Finnish President Kekkonen in November of 1958, and he offered Finland economic support to relieve the Soviet pressure. The Finnish Foreign Ministry found itself in a difficult position and ultimately declined the offer, fearing that it would do more harm than good from at least Finland's international reputation. The night frost crisis was finally resolved when Finnish President Urho Kekkonen met Nikita Khrushchev and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko in Leningrad in January of 1959. By then, President Kekkonen had forced the Fagerholm cabinet to resign, and so this was a more cordial call with Khrushchev and Andrei Gromyko. And it was during this lunch that Khrushchev declared that whilst Finland had the right to decide on its governments, the Soviet Union also had the right to decide what it thought about them. With the Fagerholm cabinet no longer in power, the economic sanctions were lifted, and by February of 1959, diplomatic relations between the two countries were also re-established. So a quick turnaround to the economic sanctions, but the result of this crisis led to the coining of a new term, Finlandization, which is the process by which one powerful country makes a smaller neighboring country refrain from opposing the powerful country's foreign policy rules while allowing it to keep its nominal independence and its own political system. Yes, as I said in episode 24 on Ukraine, it is very difficult for a small country with a powerful neighbor to have the independence of shaping its own destiny. So Finland, being a democracy, did help in speeding up the response intended out of the economic sanctions from Russia. But there was another important factor that contributed to the success of the economic sanctions. And that was the link between the sanctioning and the sanctioned state. Finland's economy was very much dependent upon Soviet Russia at the time, and any economic sanctions from the primary economic partner did have an immediate effect. So in case of Russia, what are the factors in play that can really make the economic sanctions successful? Well, for starters, the level of cohesion is very high. A lot of countries across the globe have joined towards implementing economic sanctions. But some of the key partners like China are still not part of these. And that could tilt the balance between success and failure of these economic sanctions. The second factor, which is the most interesting, is that Russia still is a dictatorship. Well, it's a democratic dictatorship where the dictator ensures that the vote is all in his favor. So that could, again, tilt the balance towards the failure of the sanctions, because there is no accountability to the people. And Vladimir Putin has already started cracking down on any protests which could lead to bringing down the government. The one thing unique about these sanctions, though, is that Russian banks have been cut off from the SWIFT messaging system, which means most of the banks in Russia do not have the ability to transact in foreign currencies such as the dollars and the euros. Russia has faced similar economic crises during the collapse of the Soviet Union. But at that time, the mood was different. Russia was opening up as a democracy and economically. So the question is, are the people going to once again live with the economic hardship? But the bigger question this time also is, are the oligarchs going to be able to live with the economic hardship created by the freezing of their economic assets across the globe? The pressure is more intense. And that's why all the more important for the United States and the European Union to keep building the diplomatic and political pressure to complement the economic pressure. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which city is considered the new financial capital of Europe? The exodus of businesses from the UK saw Amsterdam overtake London as Europe's largest share trading center for January of 2021. So the answer is B, Amsterdam. Question for the current episode. Who are the top 3 trading partners of Russia in terms of both imports and exports? Are they A, Germany, Belarus, and Turkey? B, Germany, Ukraine, and the US? C, China, Netherlands, and Germany? Or D, China, the US, and Germany? Once again, who are the top 3 trading partners of Russia in terms of both imports and exports? A, Germany, Belarus, and Turkey? B, Germany, Ukraine, and the US? C, China, Netherlands, and Germany? Or D, China, US, and Germany? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we look at the one unique country in Eastern Europe and its leader, who openly defied Joseph Stalin and maintained a unique non-aligned foreign policy during the Cold War. Yes, we'll be talking about Yugoslavia and Joseph Tito. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.